Hey folks, I'm William, this is Runeforged, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at a relatively new TTRPG system by the name of Horde Wars Advanced by Blackwall Games. I did just want to let you know that while this is not a sponsored video, I did receive a free PDF version of these rules from one of the authors. And as always, there will be links down in the video description where you can pick this up for yourself if you are so inclined. And of course, some of those links are affiliates, which means that any purchases you make after clicking on one of those links do help to support the channel at no additional cost to you. All right, just to quickly read over the description here on the Drive-Thru RPG page, it says Horde Wars is a fast-paced medieval fantasy D12 RPG. The game covers all levels of play and over 200 beasts, monsters, and NPCs for the characters to battle. The game includes character creation rules, a starting adventure, a sample town, and treasure generation tables are also included. There are also fairly detailed chapters on sailing, domain play, and the overall setting. And if you were like me and you saw this description and you're like, well, that's not really a whole lot to go on, rest assured that the description part of this page is probably the worst part about the entire system. So we've definitely got some good stuff in store as we start going through the actual PDF. All right, so here we've got the front cover of the system. And I have to say this is an absolutely gorgeous piece of art. I love the relatively realistic kind of medieval setting that we kind of find ourselves in this picture, but also with the more fantastical elements of the dragons kind of lurking in the background of the scene, as well as like a little bit of a fortification, maybe even a keeper castle that we can see kind of in that upper right hand section of the piece. And I just have to say, in general, I really do love this piece of art, and I think it does a really good job of capturing the essence of what this game is about. Next, we've got some credits here for the authors, the editor, as well as the various different artists that worked on the book. And of course, don't forget the over 100 friends and peers that helped shape the book in some way or another. I imagine a lot of those were probably playtesters. In some other videos that I've seen on this system, I believe I've heard the author say that this was a very well-tested system over the course of several years. All right, so here we've got the table of contents. Now, unfortunately, this particular table of contents is not hyperlinked kind of in the traditional way, but if you do open this up in Adobe Acrobat, there are bookmarks along the right-hand side of the screen, which is okay, but my preference would definitely be for it to be, hyperlinked directly on the page. Overall, definitely not a huge issue. So as we can see here, the overall core rules of the game only take up about 13 pages of text, which I think is absolutely fantastic and goes a long way towards making this game much more accessible than some other similar systems. So even though the overall PDF is like 300 pages long, the actual gameable rules are actually fairly short and concise, which I do very much appreciate. Next, we've got some additional information here about character creation, including some of the various different character species that the PCs can use for their characters. Next, we've got a little bit of information on the various different careers, which are essentially this game's version of classes. But unlike similar systems where you're usually only picking one character class at level 1, in this game you're actually going to be picking 2. Which kind of at first I wasn't really sure how I felt about that. That just feels like double the amount of time it takes to create your character. But I think overall in the context of the game it makes a lot of sense. It also adds a little bit of an element of customization to your character. So even if you want a little bit of flavor from a particular class, you may end up being a very different character in actuality from another player who also picks one of those classes as part of their starting 2 classes. So overall, I think this is a pretty interesting decision, and I think it'd be really cool to see how this plays out at the table, but intuition tells me that this is actually probably the correct choice for this game. Next, we've got some information on the skill system in this game, as well as, somewhat oddly, there is some setting information kind of embedded in the skills section, but it actually makes sense once you get there. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Next, we got a little bit of information about features, which are this game's version of kind of like feats or talents that you might expect to see in similar games. Then, of course, you can't have an RPG without a fairly fleshed out equipment section, which this book definitely has. And then in Chapter 8, we've got some information about some additional more advanced rules for, kingdoms and warfare. It's how you can build, conquer, or maintain like a stronghold type of area for your character or party, as well as rules for raising, maintaining, and fighting with your very own army of, soldiers or mercenaries or whatever have you. And I've never run a game that's really gone into the more domain aspects of D&D, although I have read several rule sets that kind of cover that area of play. I do think it's very cool that that information is included kind of in the core book here and isn't kind of siphoned off to like kind of a separate product, which is a really good opportunity to point out that, you know, this is a 300-page PDF, but it includes basically everything that you need to actually run this game. So there's really no other books that you need to go out and get in addition to this one, which is very nice. Now, I will say that kind of deep down, I do have a preference for separating out the player-facing stuff from the GM-facing stuff, but I think for the purposes of this game, it kind of works out just fine. And if we're being honest, we know that most players are probably not going to read the entire rulebook anyway, and will probably only read the sections that you ask them to read, if they even read those. So at the end of the day, probably not a huge risk in putting in some of the more secret GM-facing stuff in the same book. Next, Chapter 9 covers nautical adventures, so some rules for ships, seafaring, storms, as well as various different encounters that you might have on the high seas, as well as more shallow or river-adjacent areas as well. Next, we've got a chapter dedicated to kind of more the GM-focused stuff that we were talking about earlier, as well as like tips and how to manage being a GM in this game, and of course, how to generate overland travel encounters. After that, we've got 3 chapters dedicated to being kind of the bestiary for the system. So we've got a chapter specifically for beasts, which are kind of like mundane or non-magical monsters. We've got actual monsters themselves, which are kind of like the more magical or supernatural versions of monsters that you might expect. And then the final chapter here is NPCs, which are, you know, basically exactly what they sound. It's NPCs for the various different playable species that you might also be able to use as antagonists or allies during the course of your campaign. Next, we've got a whole chapter dedicated to treasure. And I will say it is a very large section, but one thing that I really like about it is that most of the magic items, if not all of them, do feel very tied into the default setting for the game, which I think makes them a lot more interesting than kind of just your generic off-the-wall kind of gonzo magical items, which are not something that I am as excited about. Next, there's an entire chapter dedicated to an introductory adventure and village, so that you can get started playing in this campaign setting right away, which I think is a very good idea and should probably be included in all system rulebooks. I think this is a really good way to kind of kickstart your campaign. And I'm a huge believer in including this type of stuff in your system. And then kind of wrapping up this section here, there is like a pretty lengthy chapter that goes over the Horde Wars setting. And I have to say, we're going to get there in a little bit, but I really do like the setting. It very much is like a fantastical analog for medieval Europe. It incorporates a lot of cool stuff from history and kind of maybe reskins them a little bit or moves them around. But there are enough fantastical elements that it does feel kind of like its own thing, but it's still familiar enough that you can kind of get the gist of what something is without having to read, pages upon pages of, lore or backstory, which I think really is kind of the sweet spot when you're talking about a TTRPG setting, at least for me, who is not really a big fan of reading through novels and novels of information in order to, just get the gist of what I need to actually start running the game. And then kind of at the end of the book, there are a few pre-generated characters, as well as a blank character sheet, which of course is pretty much a non-negotiable for a system book like this. Now, I will say before we do more of a deep dive onto these various different chapters, if you're enjoying this video so far, please consider aiding me in my eternal struggle against the dreaded YouTube algorithm by crushing those like and subscribe buttons so you don't miss out on more exciting TTRPG content like this in the future. All right, so this is a fairly large PDF, so we're definitely not going to spend a ton of time on any individual section, but I did want to talk a little bit about the core mechanic for this game. It will probably be fairly familiar to you folks who've been playing, D&D or Shadowdark or anything like that. But unlike those systems, instead of using a D20 kind of as the base for most actions, this game's actually going to use a D12. So you're going to take your D12, you're going to roll it, you're going to add any relevant modifiers that you have, and you're going to try to either meet or exceed a target number, which in this game is called a, difficulty category, aka a DC. So again, that terminology should be very familiar to you if you've played similar games to this in the past. Personally, I don't have a huge preference for a D12 over a D20. One of the interesting things about a D12 is that you are going to be critting a little bit more often. On a D20, you're going to be getting a natural 25% of the time, whereas on a D12, you're going to be getting a natural 12. I think it's like somewhere between 8 and 9%, like 8.33 or something like that percent of the time. So you are going to be critting a little bit more often than you would in a more traditional D20 system. This game does kind of use a version of advantage and disadvantage for some things, although they don't call it that in the text. And most like situational bonuses that you would typically use advantage or disadvantage for in 5e or a similar system is going to be replaced by a static +2 or -2 circumstance bonus. And of course, there are a variety of other bonuses that you can get to your roll as well. In terms of how actions work in this game, basically each round you're going to be able to move, do one action, as well as one maneuver. And for all intents and purposes, maneuvers are very similar to reactions that you would see in other systems. Although it's not necessarily used reactively, it's really just more of an action that you can use more or less anytime. It doesn't necessarily have to be on your own turn. But if you're going to equate to something, reactions is kind of the closest possible comparison. And, there are all the standard rules around moving. There's, some rules for drowning and suffocation. There's rules for jumping and falling, how long it takes to travel various different places. It talks about maneuvers, which are kind of like the reactions we talked about. Lots of information about how to do combat, which is very cool. I will say that I think in general, I hesitate to call this a rules light system because I do think that there are actually a lot of rules that aren't necessarily covered in kind of similar systems. But what I think this game really excels at is, even though there are kind of a lot of rules, I don't think that any individual rule is particularly complicated. And I think that the authors do a pretty good job of communicating those rules in a fairly clear and concise way. And I'm just going to scroll through these additional rules fairly quickly. I think most of this is fairly standard stuff if you are familiar with this type of game. So it's got a little bit of a different spin on it, but overall not incredibly different from what you're used to. Now, what may be different to you if you are coming specifically from 5e or similar systems is just how concise this rule set actually is. As you can see, most concepts are explained in maybe like 3 to 5 lines of text, which is far less than what you might see in a similar product. And again, I'm going to be skipping pages here, so there's a lot more to this that you're not seeing. Again, if you want to see the whole thing, definitely go pick up a copy using one of the links in the video description. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a quick overview of character creation. We're going to dig in a little bit more as we kind of get deeper into the book. Obviously, you're going to pick your species, which is actually going to have a mechanical impact on your character. Your species also determines one of your starting fighting styles, as well as your starting languages. Now, in this game, fighting styles is kind of similar to being proficient with a weapon, but instead of making it more likely that you're going to hit with your normal attack, it actually gives you a second attack as opposed to just having one at the beginning of the game. And also, I think it's really interesting that when you're rolling 2 attacks, it vastly increases the chance that you're at least going to achieve something meaningful on your turn, as opposed to when you're just rolling, a single attack. In terms of hit points in this game are a little bit higher than what you might expect to see in a 5e, and definitely higher than you would expect to see in kind of an old school game. In this game, you are going to be starting with 18 and then adding your fitness attribute. Attributes are typically going to be around 3 on average, so you're probably going to be starting with about 20 health, more or less. Then, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to be choosing 2 different careers instead of like the standard one, which I think is very interesting. Then you're going to have some skills that you're going to get as part of either your species or your, what do they call it, careers. And you might have the option to pick up some additional ones as well. And yep, you get to choose some additional fighting styles and languages other than those that you might get, based on the choice that you made previously in character creation. Then you have a chance to pick your starting equipment. And basically that's going to be really simple. You're not going to be picking from a huge long list of equipment, which is something that it's kind of one of pet peeve for me. I'd rather just kind of have a starting kit, which is what is the case here. And typically you're going to look at these starting equipment kits for both of your careers, and you're going to pick the one that you want the most. And then you might have a little bit of additional starting money, which you can use to purchase some additional equipment, again, if you are so inclined. I really like this. I'm not a huge fan of combing through huge equipment lists, especially when you're building a character for the first time. You don't really know what's going to be good. A lot of times, depending on the system, the equipment that you have is not particularly relevant, or only relevant if your GM makes it that way, as opposed to being inherently relevant as a result of the mechanics of the system. So yeah, I just kind of prefer this kind of more kit-based approach. And I like the fact that you do get to choose between the 2 kits of your starting careers. So it does give you a little bit more choice than just kind of, okay, you have this option and that's it. So I think this is a nice happy medium. It gives you a little bit of information about how to calculate your carrying capacity, more information about equipment, and then you get to pick a feature, which is like a feat or a talent that you would see in similar systems. Then it talks a little bit about the leveling up system in this game. Unlike more standard D20 systems, this game does not go up to level 20, instead goes up to level 12. And with really strong breakpoints happening at level 5 and level 9, which is when you will go into the next character tier. Starting at level 1, you'll get tier 2 at level 5 and tier 3 at level 9. And when you hit those various different breakpoints, you are going to get significantly stronger. As you can see, like from what you get at those various different levels, the most important of those things being a capstone ability, which you will either choose from your species or from one of your careers. And I actually like this for a variety of different reasons. One, I really do like that your species does have a more significant impact on your character than other similar games, while also kind of gating that power a little bit behind your level, which I think is very cool and maybe prevents a little bit of imbalance from happening kind of early in the game. And I think this also probably makes creating encounters a lot easier for the GM, because instead of kind of having to figure out how powerful a monster is relative to each character level, now you can kind of group them into 3 broad categories of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And I think that would probably make balancing a lot easier than other kind of similar systems. In terms of experience, you need, I think it's 12 experience to go from one level to the next. And each adventure that you complete will give you somewhere between 2 and 4 experience, which means it'll take you somewhere between 3 and 6 adventures in order to get your next level up. And quite frankly, I really do appreciate the simplicity of the system. And I think it's kind of cool that it thematically all ties into the D12 that's used as the core of the system. Another thing that I want to talk about, like you'll notice probably in this game as we kind of go through, these characters do not have a ton of different abilities. But I think that they have enough abilities and stuff that, the combat is still going to feel very interesting and compelling, while not having a massive, huge laundry list of abilities that may otherwise kind of slow down play, like I've experienced, especially with spellcasters in, games like 5e. And also, I think this game does a much better job of giving more martial-focused characters more to do on their turn, or more choices to make on their turn. And it gives you some additional information about perks, which are something you're going to be getting, roughly every other level as you advance. In my opinion, based on my understanding, these are more minor benefits than definitely more minor than a capstone ability, which is like a big heavy hitting thing, but also a little bit less impactful than the features that you're going to be getting like roughly every 3 or 4 levels. So yeah, perks are basically just kind of minor benefits that you're going to get more frequently. And you can see a list of some of the things that you're able to do when you get a new perk. Next, we get into some of the species here. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on any one of these individually, but I do appreciate the fact that all the information that you need to select this class is available on one page. But also a little bit of information about the culture of that species in this world. So here it says, humans in the world. Humans live in a variety of countries, including Ansburg, Brigmar, Franconia, and Mercia. Tells you a little bit about their primary religion, which is the Church of the Creator. It also talks a little bit about Eastrons, who are barbarians that live in the far side of the R4's river, beyond the eastern plains of Franconia. If I'm remembering correctly, these are kind of a Celt adjacent or a Celt inspired people, which I think is very cool. And I think this section really emphasizes that, I think kind of unlike other TTRPGs that kind of lump humans all into one giant category, I like the fact that it's giving us a little bit of information about some of the various different flavors of human that we might encounter in this setting. So I do like there's a little bit of differentiation, at least in the culture part of the game. And that is kind of, again, just built in directly to the setting. So I'm going to go through the rest of these a little bit more quickly. We've got all of our standard fantasy fare here. We've got dwarves, which seem very kind of Norse inspired, at least in terms of their names. And I believe in the lore of the world, they were actually the original inhabitants of the, Scandinavia adjacent area of this world before they were pretty much kicked out by the orcs of the setting, which have kind of moved into that area and now have very kind of a Norse inspired theme to them, which we'll talk about in just a second. Of course, we also have to have elves in any reasonable fantasy setting. It's very much what you would expect. They occupy the kind of Britain adjacent area of this world, which I think is very cool. Makes sense to me. And of course, we've got halflings, which you would expect to see in this type of fantasy game. And then finally, we have a little bit of an unusual pick here in the orc, which, as I kind of mentioned earlier, are kind of Norse or like Scandinavian themed in this setting. I'd say overall, I'm not a huge fan of including orcs as kind of like a playable species. I kind of like the more traditional, like orcs are kind of inherently evil, or at least are very closely aligned with some sort of dark lord, or otherwise, very monstrous. Overall, not a huge fan of that. And also this orc regeneration ability, which is at the beginning of your turn, if it's been at least 1 minute since you last took damage, you regain your full maximum hit points. I don't know enough about how the game plays to know how powerful that is, but on paper, at least, it sounds very, very strong. And I wonder if that might mess with some of the balancing in terms of, trying to have multiple encounters in a single day. And it just feels like orcs would be very powerful in that situation. But again, I think I'd have to reserve judgment until I actually had a chance to, sit down and play this for myself. But overall, not a huge fan of orcs being playable, but again, if they have to be playable, I think it's cool that they're kind of, Viking adjacent. So that's kind of cool. And that kind of brings us to the end of the playable species. Next, we've got a little bit of information on the various careers, which are, again, this game's version of classes. Acolyte is a little bit of an odd one, at least for me personally. I'm not sure exactly what this is meant to be. It kind of almost feels priest, cultist, warlocky, maybe adjacent, but the actual abilities very much seem like a spell casting focused druid. In some ways, or maybe like a seer. Yeah, I guess it's kind of like a seer kind of druid mixed together. But we actually have like a different class kind of later that we'll talk about that does feel more explicitly druidic. So I'm not exactly sure how these two classes like compare and contrast, and like when you would want to pick one over the other. But yeah, this is very interesting. The Acolyte here. Next, we've got the Archer, which is pretty much exactly what you would expect. Very cool abilities on this guy. I think if you pick this, pretty much what you're going to be in for. And we've also got an Assassin, which very much kind of the same thing. Mostly, this looks like mostly kind of a martial class, but kind of one of the capstone abilities here is kind of supernatural in nature, where you just kind of go fully invisible. And I think that's totally fine for high level thieves or assassins to have a little bit more of a supernatural element. I think that's fine. So I think this class is very cool. Next, we've got the Blade Master, which is a very weapons-focused martial class. And I do especially appreciate that there do appear to be some Princess Bride-related Easter eggs here. The capstones being called Prepare to Die and To the Pain. And I've actually seen several different references to, various different works of fiction and fantasy that I'm personally a big fan of. And I've always really liked it when authors are very open about what their sources of inspiration are, and maybe embed little Easter eggs into the text, so that true fans of that particular thing will see it, pick up on it, and appreciate it. So I really do like that. Next, we've got the Crusader, which appears to be kind of like a more martially focused paladin. But he does also have the ability to make his attacks solar damage, which I guess is this game's equivalent of holy damage. So there is a little bit of a supernatural or divine element here as well, even though most of the class is mostly physical/martial. Next, we've got the Deep Delver, which is as close as I can tell is really more of like a very dungeon-focused thief type of character. So they're good at springing traps. They might know a little bit about the history of objects they find in the dungeon. They have an ability called Crypt Raider and Dungeon Breaker. So again, a very dungeon-focused kind of expert or thief character. Very, very cool. I think this is very cool for, like the dwarf version of kind of a thief or a scout character. So I like that quite a bit. Next, we've got the Huntsman, which as far as I can tell is kind of like a martial version of the Ranger with, maybe a little bit of elements of the Witcher mixed in for good measure. So they have the ability to track down their prey, which makes sense for a hunter type of class. This Glimmer oil here gives me, shades of the Witcher, where, there's various different potions that the Witcher is mixing, and they're kind of preparing for fights ahead of time, doing a little bit of scouting to figure out what type of creature they're facing, and then, using the appropriate consumable, although I don't think they're consumable in this case. Yeah, then using the appropriate, consumable or item or whatever to make them especially deadly against that particular type of target. So again, very cool. Not enough Witcher adjacent classes in these D&D type of games for my liking, so I'm glad that it is represented here. I will point out that I don't think there's anything inherently magical about this class, unlike a Witcher, so that is a little bit of a difference between, that type of fiction and what you're seeing in this game. Next, we've got the Knight, which is kind of which feels like a more martial focused kind of knightly fighter class, with particular emphasis on riding as a skill, as well as defense using a shield and attacking opponents with smite, although this is more like a physical version damage of that, so hitting really hard. And that is definitely a character class that I can get behind. I do feel like, I don't feel like we see enough knights in like traditional D&D. We definitely see like warriors and kind of berserker, barbarian classes a lot, but very few true actual knightly analogs. And I'm glad that we get to see a dedicated knightly class in this game. Next, we've got the Mercenary, which is kind of like, it's definitely a martial focused class, but it's kind of a hybrid. It's definitely got a ranged element to it in the form of potentially mastery or proficiency with crossbows. There's also like a kind of shield component here as well. I think there's like an ability where they can, crossbow and shield, or one of their capstones where they can use a crossbow and shield at the same time. So I'm imagining kind of like some of those medieval mercenaries that would set up their huge shields in front of them and then kind of use them for cover as they kind of shoot around them. That's very cool. But then kind of in addition to the more ranged aspect of this class, there is also a melee component. Like it says lunge here. Your next melee weapon attack this turn deals an additional die of damage, and its reach is extended by 1 combat space. So you're seeing a little bit more like a tactical kind of fighter emerging out of the mercenary. And then one of its capstones, Sergeant of Arms, almost feels kind of warlordy if you're familiar with 4th edition D&D, where this is more of kind of like a martial like leader or tactician kind of element that's being folded into this class as well. So again, really more of like a martially focused hybrid, which I think is very cool. Next, we've got the monk, which is not your traditional like kind of Eastern style of monk that you would typically see in like a D&D type of game. This class is really interesting. It feels like it has more of a non-combat focus than some of the other classes that we've looked at so far, really with an emphasis on like languages, writing, and the ability to scribe various different magical scrolls. So that's a very interesting take on this type of class that I haven't really seen before. But it's also not completely defenseless in combat. It also gets one of its basic abilities called Wallop, which it says when you deal damage to a creature with a melee weapon or melee weapon attack, you can use Wallop to knock him prone. So definitely a little bit of combat prowess ability here, kind of more like a kind of crowd control-y kind of way, which I think kind of makes sense with the nature and flavor of the class. But then as you start to get into some of the higher levels of the monk, they get some, kind of supernatural adjacent capstone abilities, which I think is very cool and fitting for the type of class that this is trying to be. Next, we've got the priest. These casters are very much wielding the power of light and flame and holy protection. So one of their abilities is Sunblast, so this is like holy damage ability, kind of like smite or something like that. They've also got healing, and as well as the also important raise dead ability, which of course is going to be very important if you are playing a fairly lethal game, as this one does appear to be, although maybe not in the more traditional sense that you might be used to, like an OSR game where you're going to be dying all the time. But definitely because you're going to be fighting hordes of enemies, it's in the game, Horde Wars Advanced. We're going to be fighting a lot of hordes of enemies. There's definitely a chance that you are going to be going down in the course of combat. And it's always nice to have a little bit of raise dead for a bit of a pick-me-up. So yeah, very, very cool. And of course, some awesome capstone abilities, which you're welcome to pause and read if you are so inclined. Next, we've got the Skald, which is a Norse-inspired warrior poet with a little bit of supernatural abilities as well. This class does have a little bit more non-combat functionality, maybe more socially focused than some of the ones that we've seen previously, while also having the ability to inspire their companions to help make various different checks a little bit easier than they otherwise would have been. But down in the capstone section, we also see several of these options which are very combat focused and are no doubt very powerful when employed in the correct fashion. Next, we've got a class that I haven't really seen before in a lot of MMOs called the Tavern Wench. And as you might expect, this is a more socially focused class, which definitely has elements of kind of like an enchantment kind of flavored bard, where they're really skilled at kind of social checks. They're skilled at enchantments and charms, stuff like that. So yeah, definitely taking some inspiration from the bard class while also giving it a little bit of a unique feel that I haven't really seen in other games. So I'd be really interested to see, how this class actually played out at the table. Next, we've got a fairly standard thief, which if you're looking at it very much does feel like what you might expect. Although I will say, not so much focused on traps necessarily, but definitely things related to burglary and typical thief shenanigans, other than maybe the trap disabling, which maybe falls more under the I think it was the Dungeon Delver or the Deep Delver class that we looked at a little bit earlier. And I wanted to point out that the capstone ability here, Spell Thief, does allow you to do a little bit of a dip into a more magical type of class. If that is something that you are inclined to do, which I think is very, very cool. Because I think thieves and wizards definitely go together fairly well, and I'm glad to see that option is available. Next, we've got the Viking class, which is pretty much exactly what you might expect it to be. I do have to say that I'm really excited by the amount of Norse-inspired kind of flavor and classes that we are seeing in this system, as I really do like to incorporate that into my more traditional you know, more British focused TTRPG settings that I typically like to run. So I do like seeing more Norse inspired stuff bleeding in from time to time. And I think this is a really good rendition of what a Viking should be. Of course, we got a bonus to sailing and athletics and sailing skills in various situations, along with the classic kind of you know, berserker kind of flavor that you often see associated with Viking warriors. Next, we've got a pretty wide selection of various different wizard classes. And I have to say that one thing I really like about the way that this game does classes is that you don't just have one kind of catch-all wizard. Each of these various different wizards are associated with a color, an element, and they usually have like one other kind of subspecialization that is also a part of this particular kit. And I think breaking that up and making each of these classes a little bit more thematic, I don't know if it's objectively better, although you could definitely make an argument for that. I think that, you know, just subjectively, I really like that approach a lot more than this kind of catch-all standard wizard where you're just, you know, picking piecemeal of like these random different spells. I like this very focused thematic approach that we're seeing here. So the blue wizard here is a kind of lightning focus wizard, which is very, very cool. I love a good lightning mage. And then kind of one of their special abilities is kind of, it's kind of like a limited form of teleportation where you can basically you basically create a bridge from the area that you're at to, I think it's like a location. Okay. Another location anywhere in the world that you can currently see. Okay. So somewhere within line of sight. And then you can use that as a means of magical transportation. But the catch is that it stays active for 1d4 rounds, which means that, you know, people you don't necessarily want to be able to come through your portal or go across your bridge may be able to follow you to wherever you're trying to go. So I think that's really interesting. And then it's also got another capstone here called Magic Mirror, which appears to be a form of scrying, which I think is very cool. Next, we've got the Brown Wizard. And this is really what I would think of as a more traditional druidic class, kind of in contrast to the acolyte that we saw earlier, which also kind of had, you know, vaguely druidic or seer-like vibes, at least to me. And this class, again, is focused more on acid and on shapeshifting, which I think actually makes a lot of sense in the context of your more traditional druid. So I like that quite a bit. Next, we've got the classic Gray Wizard, although this is more of a thunder or sound focused wizard, which I think is very interesting, like a sonic wizard. It also has a kind of a subspecialization in kind of creating magical barriers. So one of his core abilities is Magical Shield, which absorbs damage, which is very cool. And then as a capstone ability, it's got Force Bubble, which is going to create a large impenetrable bubble of force, which you can use to protect your allies in times of danger. So very, very cool. Very, very cool class there in the Grey Wizard. Next, we've got the Red Wizard, which is kind of like your classic Pyromancer or Fire Mage, which again, I am a huge fan of. And then the kind of subspecialization for this class is kind of around like some movement related things. So they have a haste spell, which is, you know, functions, you know, relatively similar to how you might expect. And then they also have some powers around teleportation, which I think is a cool secondary for a fire mage. And then lastly, we have the White Wizard, which is very much a frost or ice themed wizard. And then they also have a little bit of a subspecialization in kind of illusion magic. And I think that's really interesting, kind of pairing ice and illusion together. I think that's very cool. Overall, I think I mentioned it earlier, but I do like this idea that you're taking one of the classic elemental elements, and then you are working in a few small things from one of the various different classical schools of wizardry, which I think is just a really interesting idea. And I don't know how it works in practice, but in theory, it does seem like a very cool idea. And I'm on board for this more thematic style of wizard. So very, very interesting. And it's also important to keep in mind, you're not just picking one of these kind of, you know, schools or robe colors that's going to make up the entirety of your abilities. You know, you could theoretically pick two different wizard classes and, you know, have benefits of both of those, which I think is very, very cool. So we've got a little bit of information about the various different skills. One thing that I do want to point out, there is some really interesting information, kind of setting information embedded in the skill section here. It's a really interesting way of kind of showing the things that you might know if you are very skilled in these various different skills. And also does a little bit of world building as well. I did notice that there's a section here that has Pegasi in between arts and culture and astronomy. I don't know how this is related to skills. It's possible that it is just a typo or something that was put there on accident. But there's only been like And I did notice maybe one or two other places in the book where there was a piece of information that didn't necessarily seem directly related to that thing. But it's relatively few and far between. It's not actually hurting anything. I just thought it was an odd place to put that information on Pegasus. Next, we got a little bit of information here about the astronomy skill, and much more interesting to me than the actual astronomy skill itself. I'm really excited by the idea of these astronomical events that occur within this setting, and how those can be used for plot hooks for some of your various different adventures. So, you know, some of these are pretty standard. Like I think there's a blood moon here, you know, which the entire land is covered in blood red light for 1d4 days, you know, which typically creates a problem with werewolves who are coming out and going, you know, crazy during this blood moon. You know, we've got something called the Angel's Blade, which is a comet, which is kind of like a good divinely related omen. And after you see it, it's like a sign of the creator god's favor. And during that season, there's a bumper crop and a population boom. So there's like good astrological events as well, which I think is very, very cool. Yeah, there's one here that foretells the coming of a fiend who has entered the world. So that might be like a point of contention for your characters. And there's a Dragon's Tail Comet, which is a harbinger for battle and war, which is very, very interesting. There's another thing here called Falling Star, which is a meteor, which your characters can then go track down and harvest some of that star metal, potentially to either sell off or turn into some sort of very powerful weapon, which I think is a very cool idea. Anyway, there's several of these, and I think they're all very cool, and I love kind of the flavor this adds to the world, and the fact that there are these, like, you know, not common necessarily, but events that could happen in your world that could spur some sort of adventure or something along those lines. So very, very cool. And I'm gonna speed through the rest of these skills. Feel free to, you know, if you want to look at this in more detail, please feel free to go pick up a copy for yourself. Lots of cool and interesting information about the skills, but if I go this slow, we're going to be here all day. Next, we got a little bit of information on the various different features that you can pick up as part of your character creation or character advancement process. Again, these are, you know, your feats or traits that you would see in very similar systems. I'm not going to go through these in too much detail, but I am just going to scroll through them briefly if you'd like to, you know, pause and take a look at some of the various different options. They are kind of broken down into various like general features versus more combat features. And then you also have a section for these more magic or supernatural features, which are, you could equate these to bonus spells that you get for picking up some of these various different features, which is very, very cool. One that I think is really interesting, for example, is Cold Snap. Requires you to have magical training. When you deal cold damage to a creature, you can use Cold Snap to encase his lower body in ice. His speed is reduced to 0 for the next 1d4 rounds. So it's basically like an ice nova or a freeze of some kind that prevents your opponent from moving anywhere, which I think is very, very cool. And of course, it is also limited to, you know, only one use a day per the tier that your character is. So tier 1, you're only going to use this once a day. Tier 2, twice a day. Tier 3, 3 times a day. Very, very cool. I think this is a good system. I like the additional variety this is adding. And also allows you to pick this up on several different classes. So this is not just limited to the white mage, for example, which is, you know, typically the more frost-based mage, but anyone with magical training can get this ability. And again, just scrolling through briefly to show you all the various different features there. All right, moving into the equipment section here. Again, not going to spend a ton of time on this. I will say that I do like the kind of the variety of different weapons here. I like that most, if not all of these, are slightly different. Based on mostly on the damage numbers that it's dealing, but also the various different properties that the weapon has. And there are some very interesting properties included on these various different weapons. Several of these like trigger on critical hits, or they score a critical hit on an improved range. Just lots of really interesting stuff on here that is a little bit more interesting than what you saw in the, you know, 5e 2014 version of weapons. And to be fair, most of the OSR kind of stuff as well. It doesn't seem clear to me right away that there is like a best weapon. There is a lot more give and take in terms of what, you know, effect or property you want to have on your weapon. And that may be a little bit more impactful than how much damage it does. But just kind of depends on the situation and what kind of character you are trying to build. Again, I'll just scroll through some of these weapons sets here and adventuring gear, clothing. Some of these do have mechanical impacts, some of them don't. Again, I'm going to speed through this. Feel free to pause if you want to take a closer look. Some information here about various different mounts and vehicles, which makes sense, very important in this type of setting, especially if you're going to be playing more, you know, higher level domain level play. Very interesting stuff there. Some prices for, you know, various different inns and trade goods, stuff like that. All right, and then we move into the Kingdoms and Warfare chapter. Again, I've not played in a campaign where we've done lots of domain level play, so this is very new to me. So I don't really have a lot to compare this to, but I will say that I do like the system as it's laid out here, as far as I can tell. Most systems either don't touch on domain level play at all, or they have super detailed rules for how to manage every single possible thing that could happen when you are running your own domain. And that is a little bit too much information for me to want to deal with. And I feel like this is again, rules light, probably not the correct term for this, but this is much more reasonable in terms of the amount of information that I am willing to digest about the concept of domain play and mass combat rules. So I think this is a nice happy medium between not having anything and having a super complex system that spans 100 pages or more about how to manage domain. Just not something I'm interested in personally. I think this is a good mix. Next, a little bit of information about nautical encounters. Again, not something I'm super interested in personally, but I do like the fact that it is available in this book. And if I had to imagine, it falls into a very similar category as Kingdoms and Warfare, where it's nice that it is included, but doesn't have like hundreds and hundreds of pages of how to do every minutia of traveling on the sea, which again, I think is probably a nice, happy medium. All right. Next, we've got some information here about how to be a game master in this game. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. There's some interesting stuff though, if you want to pause and read it for yourself. Information about how to generate overland travels, time of day, starting distance, morale, all the stuff that you expect to see for a random combat generator in one of these types of games. Next, we move into the kind of bestiary section of the book, with chapter 11 being focused on beasts, which are kind of like mundane or non-magical monsters. Again, not going to spend a ton of time on this. I will say that there is a huge variety of stat blocks here, which I do very much appreciate. And also when we get to, I'll just say that I will say that I think this is just the right amount of information for stat block. I think this is, like I said, just enough information to make the fight interesting without overburdening the GM with tons of different various possible actions and spells that that the creature could be using during its turn. I haven't mentioned it so far, but there's not a ton of art throughout the rest of the book, but there is definitely a lot more in the bestiary section overall. And in particular, I really do like this piece with the Kraken here. This is very evocative and very scary. I'm glad that I am not personally on that boat. Again, I'm going to scroll through the rest of these very, very quickly. Again, feel free to pause if you see anything that you might want to read more on. I'm actually just going to skip to the next section. All right, next we've got actual monsters. These are the less mundane, more magical versions of the creatures that you might encounter out in the world. One thing I will say that I like about this bestiary is that this dragon section in particular, lots of very cool art. And I love the fact that a lot of these dragons, maybe even all these dragons, are actually named creatures. So these are very specific dragons. And the reason that I like that so much is that I really like it when dragons are super powerful creatures in the scale of the campaign setting. And I don't really want a dragon to be like, I don't just want your basic dragon to be a random encounter. I want each encounter that the players have with the dragons to be, unique and memorable. Yeah, these are slightly larger stat blocks than what you'd see for some of the other creatures, but I think that's okay. You'll probably only be fighting one thing at a time, and it's probably going to be the dragon, which is very, very cool. And I like games where you can have interesting, cool, and relatively balanced fights with just a single boss monster, and you don't require a ton of different minions or whatever to even the odds, like in terms of like action economy or whatever. As you can see, some really cool different dragons here. And then finally we get to Dargoth Kingsbane. I for whatever reason, this art just really grabbed me. He does have substantially more hit points than some of the other dragons that came before him. So obviously a very scary, powerful creature. And of course he is a fire breathing dragon. So the classic fire dragon archetype. Very, very cool. And of course, there are a ton of other different ones here, ending with Umbara, the Queen of Dragons. And I assume that she is the biggest and baddest of all the dragon kind in the setting. Very, very cool. Here's another example. There's a sidebar here about hexagonal grids. I don't think this applies to much in this stat block. I mean, there are instances where there's like degrees for the cone breath weapons, but I don't know if this is the best place to put that information. It just seems a little bit out of place here. There may be somewhere else in the book where this would maybe fit more, but maybe this is the only place they had space to put it. So I don't know. Then some more information about Dracarans. These are kind of Dragonborn equivalents in the setting. They serve the dragons. We'll talk about them a little bit more in the setting section of the book. I will say that I do appreciate whenever there's these kind of humanoid monsters, this book does a really good job of giving you several different variations of that creature that kind of maybe fill different roles. So, you know, you have your basic Dracaran Raider, you've got like a Dragon Priest version, you've got like a Slaver, you've got a Commander, you've got a Gladiator. So several different variations that maybe fill different roles or have different power levels. So you can continue using these creatures as antagonists, you know, throughout the course of the game, and it's not just limited to one particular tier of play, which I very much appreciate. And we're just gonna keep going here. Tons of different monsters. Winter Queen looks very cool. I'd like to fight her. This feels kind of Fae in origin to me. I don't know if that's correct or not. Yeah, we're in the Fae section. This is a very cool looking Fae creature here. Would love to use this in my game. Some fiends. Ooh, that's a cool piece of art. I like that. Looks like some undead here, some giants, including some named giants, like the Giant King. That's very cool. I love these kind of named monsters that are thrown in here to be kind of exemplars for that particular faction or species. Very, very cool. Of course, you can't have a fantasy game without having some goblins. I actually really like this art, even though it's kind of minimalistic. I like this. He looks very, like his shadowed face looks very dark and sinister, which I like for my goblins. Yeah, I like this take on goblins. I like the fact, again, that there are so many different stat blocks for them. Some cool art. We've got a Goblin King, which I think is good. And then also a named, I assume this is a named Goblin King called Glug the Boneless, with some pretty cool little abilities here and a magical weapon as well. So I love this art down here. It's very evocative of this type of Goblin King type of character. Very reminiscent of the Goblin King from The Hobbit. You know, much less so the Labyrinth. That's a different kind of Goblin King. This is like a Hobbit adjacent Hobbit adjacent version. Next, we got golems. Yep, very cool. A rune-bound Colossus. This looks awesome. Gives me very Shadows of the Colossus vibes, which is a fantastic game. Here we've got I love this artwork. So this is like a horned lord. I guess he's kind of like an anti-paladin or a dark knight or something. Very, very cool creature. I love this artwork down here. Yeah, almost kind of gives me like Wild Hunt kind of vibes. I'm not sure if that's what the intention was, but yeah, very, very cool. Oh, Call of the Hunt. Yes, looks like this is Wild Hunt adjacent. Flea Mortals. I wonder if that is an homage to the Matt Colville MCDM game that's coming out soon. Probably is. I really like, again, I think I talked about this earlier, but the author does, I like that the author wears his inspirations on his sleeve and he inputs these little Easter eggs for people that are, you know, familiar with the source material. Very, very cool. We got some liches in here, of course. How can you not have liches? We got an arch lich in here. Okay, so this is a really beefy stat block. This is a full page, but I do appreciate that everything that I need to run this guy is on a single page, even though there are an absolute ton of abilities here. I would imagine this is like, you know, a very substantial, you know, capstone, like end of campaign kind of boss. And I think that those kinds of really impactful bosses, I like it when those more impactful bosses have more mechanics going on and makes for more complex and challenging fights. So I think this is an acceptable amount of abilities, maybe a little bit more than I would prefer, but I think pretty good overall, and I think it's probably make for a really exciting combat encounter. Very, very cool. Got Medusa here, we got Minotaur, ogres. We're just gonna keep going. Oh, some skeletons. So we love some good skeletons. Again, I love the fact there are multiple different versions of the skeleton. Looks like we've got a rotted skeleton, which looks like an easier kind of maybe lower level version of a skeleton fight. And then you can contrast that with a skeleton warrior who is a bit more powerful. Yeah, tons of different variations of skeletons, trolls. I love a good vampire. Oh, this art is fantastic. Yeah, this is absolutely a vampire lord. I love this art down here with kind of the shadows of the people kind of reaching up towards him. Yeah, this is just fantastic. Wardens, I don't know if these are some types of elementals or not. I'm not really sure exactly what those are. They look cool though. Got some werewolves here. Werewolf alpha. These guys, I think the lore is that if a werewolf makes it through 2 different blood moons, they turn into an alpha werewolf and they actually can't turn back into their human forms and they become super, super powerful. Yeah, I think that's listed down here somewhere. Yeah, very cool. We got some whites, including the White King. I love this art. Witches, can't have a good fantasy campaign without some witches. Again, various different levels of witch. We got a regular witch. We've got a warlock. I'm curious. Yeah, so the warlock looks like it's more powerful than the witch. And then the most powerful of all is the witch king, or sorry, witch queen. I was thinking the witch king of Angmar. That's not that. This is the witch queen. Very, very cool though. I love a good witch. Got a ton of zombies in here, including a zombie crusader, which is very cool. I like that a lot. And then NPCs. So these are the NPC versions of the various different playable species in the game. And again, I love there's different varieties of the different species NPCs. Very, very cool. I like this Spellblade art. It's kind of cool. And of course, you have to have an elf lord. Very cool. Halflings, orcs. Got some human barbarians. Again, this is kind of the more Celtic influence that I was alluding to earlier, which I think is very cool. Human soldiers from some of the various different areas. I like how the different regions of the human world have different specializations in terms of combat. So like Ansburg is known for their pikemen, Brigmar is known for their crossbowmen, and the Franconians are known for their horse archers, which is very, very cool. I definitely approve. Very cool stuff. A whole section here on human crusaders and knights, which again I very much appreciate. Love good knights. Man, there's just so many monsters and NPCs, which is fantastic. It's gonna, it's so crazy to me that this kind of indie produced TTRPG system manages to have like more and better monsters than a lot of kind of more flagship titles do, in at least in their core rulebook. So it's really nice. I think it's very cool. All right, so next we kind of come into the treasure section here. Again, I'm just gonna scroll through this. Man, I feel like I'm missing out on so much good stuff here. But yeah, this video is going to be like 2 hours long if I don't speed things up a little bit. And I don't know how many of you are going to stick around for a 2-hour video. So what I will say, I really like the item section in this book. There's a lot of really cool items in here. And what I love the most is that they are, all of them, or at least most of them, are tied into the actual setting of the game. And I just find that really helps with, I don't know, I just really like it when that's the case. I don't like kind of these off-the-wall, kind of zany gonzo magic items that, you know, could appear in any random setting. I like the ones that are either, you know, fairly generic fantasy, like something that you would see in like kind of a Lord of the Rings, or that are very specifically tailored to this world, or the various different historical or NPC figures that are currently inhabiting the setting. It's just very, very cool. Again, just going to keep scrolling. This is a ton of different items. This is crazy. Again, we can see the Kraken art, which I appreciate. It's a very cool piece. Okay, so we are getting towards the end here. This section here, or this chapter, is the introductory adventure that you can use to introduce your characters and players to this setting. It is kind of bare bones. I think the whole thing is just like on like 2 pages. But if I'm being completely honest, after I read through this is pretty much all the information that you actually need to run this little adventure. And I think it is a very reasonable size for an introductory adventure. It basically gives you everything you need. And then also, as you know, it's a very simple but very clear and straightforward map. Now you could go a different route and put a bit more detail into your introductory adventures. But again, honestly, I think this is probably all that I would need in order to run this adventure effectively. So I think it's totally fine that it is fairly kind of bare and minimalistic. And again, I really appreciate that a map was included. Now, I don't know. I did get a copy of this from the author. I don't know if a separate copy of this map is available as kind of a separate image file. If so, that's really awesome. If not, maybe something to consider adding in the future, at least for the PDF copy. I think that would be very much appreciated. I will say that, yeah, this does look like a player-facing map. I don't think that it would hurt to have this map be... I don't think it would hurt to have a GM-facing version of the map in the actual book that is numbered, and those numbers would, correlate to the various different sections that are outlined on the page previously. I could see it being a little confusing, trying to jump back and forth, figure out exactly what area is which. So if I had some criticisms to make on the map, make this a GM-facing version of the map, and with numbers on it, and maybe even a little bit of information about what's in each room directly on the map, and then have those numbers line up with the actual rooms that are included in the detail section. So that would be my feedback. Here we've got a little bit of information about the introductory village that you can use to start off your campaign. This is the village of Grimstead. Gives you some information about the key locations and people in the town. Again, nothing super complicated about this, fairly simple. But again, I think it's probably everything that you need in order to run this settlement effectively. So I think that is quite nice. Here we have a full color map of the Witchwood, which is kind of the starting region for the campaign. I'm not going to go into too much detail about all the various different locations in the setting, because again, we are running very long. But I like this map quite a bit, and there is more information about each of these various different points of interest and what you might be able to find once you get there. Also gives you a little bit of information of how to populate your mega dungeons, including like how the actual structure of the dungeon is going to look, as well as the various different encounters that you might find as you are exploring those dungeons. Again, fairly simple and minimalistic, but also again, probably exactly what you need in order to run these various different locations. All right, next we get to the Horde Wars setting itself. And it's a shame that this is kind of so late in the book, because I think this is actually one of the highlights of the entire supplement. I'm a really big fan of this setting. As I mentioned earlier, it is very much like a fantastical analog of medieval Europe. In fact, I will scroll down here and show you the map, and you will probably recognize this right away. As a slightly shifted around version of Europe. The human areas, if I remember correctly, are mostly kind of here in this central area. Mercia, despite being kind of French in location, is kind of more British. Franconia, I think, is more overtly French, and with maybe some elements of Italian sprinkled in there as well. Brigmar, I think, is kind of more German. I can't remember between Ansberg or Brigmar what their relationship is, but it does say the Grunwald Forest here, so I'm going to go ahead and assume this is Germany adjacent. Caerwyn here is I believe the ancestral home of the elves in this setting, which is very cool. I like that they're kind of on the British Isles over here. This Valheim section here, originally, I believe, the home of the dwarves before they were kind of pushed out of their ancestral lands by the orcs, who are now kind of occupying that area. And then Andalus down here, and what would be like kind of Spain and Portugal. This is more like Middle Eastern flavored, I think. And instead of being mostly human occupants, I'm pretty sure this is dragon occupied territory, mostly occupied by the dragonkin, and then their actual dragon kind of overseers who they kind of see as gods. And I think there's also a pretty heavy halfling presence in this area as well, although I might be misremembering. And then this Eastron section over here, as I said, kind of very Celtic inspired. Again, I think this is just a really awesome setting. I love this map. Could it be fleshed out a little bit more? Would I like to see more points of interest on the map? I mean, yeah, maybe. But I also understand that the author probably wants to leave a little bit of room for the GM to put their own stuff in the world. And I think that this is a good enough starting place that any GM should have no problems getting their campaign kicked off in this setting, which I think is quite cool and is something that I would definitely run for my players if I had the time to do so. Again, more information here about the various different areas. I think I covered most of it, just kind of in that quick overview. Man, there's just so much cool stuff here. Definitely feel free to pause and read through some of this stuff at your own leisure. And also, honestly, at this point, if you're still at this video and we're like, I don't know, like we're over an hour in and you're still watching this, chances are you are probably going to enjoy this setting quite a bit. And at that point, you might as well just go pick it up, at least the PDF version, over on DriveThruRPG, using one of the links down in the video description. But yeah, so just tons of information here about the various different regions of the world. And then finally, to cap everything off, these are just the pre-generated character sheets for the various different characters that you can kind of use as your starter characters if you don't want to go through the entire character creation process. Although honestly, character creation process didn't seem that bad in terms of how long it would take to create one. So you could use one of these pre-gens, or you could use the blank sheet here at the end of the book and create your own custom character. All right, so I know that was a long one. I appreciate you sticking with me, or even if you just skip to this last kind of final thoughts section, that's totally fine as well. But yeah, so what are my overall thoughts on Horde Wars Advanced by Blackwall Games? Overall, I think this is a really awesome system. Honestly, I think I only have a couple complaints about the system overall. I think the biggest issue is probably kind of the bare kind of layout. There's like a lot of white space. There's not a ton of art. The art that is there, I do like quite a bit, but there's not a ton of it. And even though I understand that art is very expensive, and it can be very tempting to kind of overlook. It can be kind of tempting to overlook presentation, layout, artwork, and that kind of stuff in your TTRPG system. I think it is actually really important to getting people hooked into the overall vibe and setting that you're trying to establish in your game. Also, I think that this is not directly related to the book, but the drive-through RPG page here is a little bit bare bones in terms of information about the actual product itself. I think it would be nice to see a little bit more information here. Maybe put some of the art on here as well, so people get an idea of what it is that they're going to be seeing. Maybe enabling a bit of a preview here for some of the more interesting sections of the book. I think you can show off enough of the cool stuff about this supplement that will get people hooked in, without giving them so much that they feel like they don't need to purchase the book and you can just run the game based purely off of the preview. I don't think that is a reasonable concern to have. Then also there were a couple sections in the book where there were some like additional call outs on certain pages that didn't necessarily feel like they felt 100% tied in to the primary theme of that page or the primary content on that page. And some of that could be it could just be like a typo kind of thing where it was an accident. It could be that was the only place they had space to put it, and it was the place that made the most sense. I'm not really sure. There were only a couple instances like that, but they did stick out to me in a couple occasions. But other than those things, which are honestly really minor overall, I think this is a really awesome system. I love the fact that everything you need to run this is in this one 300-page PDF. It's all in one book. You can get it for just $20 US if you just want to get a digital version of it. I think that even though there's not a ton of art in here, the art that is in there is very cool and evocative of the setting. I particularly really enjoy the cover, as well as some of the art pieces for some of the more powerful classic monsters, like some of the dragon art in there is very cool. There's a vampire lord in there that I thought was really awesome. There's like a couple pieces scattered throughout the entire book. The Kraken, for example, is really good. So the art that's in there is very good. I think that the system. So I have not played this, so it could change. It could change after I actually do play it. But based on what I saw compared to other systems that I've read, I feel like this game does a pretty good job of balancing. Like I said, there's a lot of rules in this game, but no individual rule looks particularly complex, and for the most part all of the rules are written in a fairly like clear and concise way, which I think would actually probably make this game much more digestible than you might think, just kind of looking at the 300 page count for the PDF. The basic rules for the system were only like 13 pages long, which I think is a pretty good length for just kind of your basic rules. I also really love the setting, as I touched on earlier. I have a really soft spot in my heart for fantasy Europe adjacent settings, and I think this is one of the better versions of a fantasy Europe kind of adjacent area that I've seen in TTRPGs, and I really appreciate that. This is not just like kitchen sink fantasy setting. It does feel very themed and focused in a way that I find very appealing. But yeah, so overall, very, very cool product. I will, dude, there are just, the problem is there's just too many good games that have come out in the last couple months. But yeah, time permitting, I'd absolutely love to run this game. I just want to at least do the one shot, like maybe the brief introductory adventure, and just kind of see how it plays the table. But overall, I think this is a really impressive product. I think it's awesome that this was done by a pretty small indie team. They managed to create a complete rule set for, and they're selling it for only $20. And if you thought it looked cool, I highly encourage you to go pick it up and give it a shot for yourself. I am curious. This is going to be a longer video. I'm curious if you'll let me know down in the comments whether you liked this kind of longer preview, or if you'd like to go back to a more concise, structured first impressions that I more typically do. So definitely let me know down in the comments. But also, if you enjoyed this video, I do have a playlist of other TTRPG system reviews. If you'd like to check this out, that playlist should be popping up on your screen here in the very near future, if it hasn't already. Yeah, I think that's about it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day. Bye.